We start a message with a business video, but there you have it. The story of the baton that is being used to go around the world at the moment and has just arrived in Glasgow in advance of the Commonwealth Games. And if you were watching the news this morning, you will have seen that some bright spark tried to nick it. That baton represents all that the Commonwealth Games is supposed to exemplify. It is meticulously made, it's meticulously planned. And what I hope you saw from that video was that the values of the games are woven into the baton itself, the thing that's passed from one person to another. So that the very idea, the very DNA of the Commonwealth Games is represented by that one object that's going to be taken into the stadium at the beginning of the ceremony. Now, we've been looking at Deuteronomy on Sunday mornings, and we've been progressing through the different parts of the book, looking at the way especially in which God wanted his people to turn from a dynasty of families all relating their ancestry back to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, into a nation, and a nation that was going to be God's witness on this earth. The idea behind the nation of Israel was that people would look at it and say, oh, that's what God's like. And that was going to be shown in their politics, it was going to be shown in their leadership, it was going to be shown in their faith, it was going to be shown in their families, it was going to be shown in their civic life. All the way round, it was supposed to exemplify who God was. And now, that baton, that DNA, is going to be passed from one person, from Moses, to another. And that's what today's passage is all about. So maybe you'd like to find it, Jeremiah chapter 31, and also find the notes which come in your news sheet. And there'll be a pen in the seat, and you'll find the outline, and you can make some additional notes which will also come up on the screen if you want to. You see, leadership is more about upholding values than it is about doing a task. So when a leader changes, it is passing on the values that is so important. And it doesn't matter whether those values are the values of a monarch, a prime minister, a mayor of a city, a CEO of a company, a minister in a church, or a leader of a small group. Those values are the values that you pass on when leadership changes, when the baton is handed from one person to the next. And as we look at Deuteronomy 31, we're going to see some significant questions answered about passing on the baton, about passing it on to another person so that they can carry on where we or where someone else leaves off. And the first question I want to ask is, where were the children of Israel at this point? Because that's significant when it comes to answering the other questions about passing on a baton. Let's remember that they were on the eastern side, where that red circle is. They were on the eastern side of the River Jordan, and they were anticipating a massive change, going over the Jordan and conquering the promised land, the land that had been promised to them by God, the land that they knew they were going to have to occupy. They knew it was going to be tough, but yet nevertheless they were committed to doing it. They were poised and ready to go. And you might think that this is the key moment. This is the moment when they need their leader. They need Moses to be with them. And so that's our first question for this morning. When is the baton going to be passed? And the answer is there in verses 1 and 2. Moses went out and he spoke these words to all of Israel. I'm now 120 years old. And I'm no longer able to lead you. I mean, he wasn't just an old man, he was an ancient man. Don't forget, Moses didn't start leading the children of Israel until he was 80, which even in their day was getting on a bit. Of course, we have to recognize a distinction between their day and ours. In ancient Israel, a man or a woman of great age was regarded with greater respect because of their age. In sharp contrast, in a Western society, we tend to write off the aged as being irrelevant and past it. That wasn't true so much in their day. But there were two things that Moses recognized about himself that made this the right time to pass on the baton. The first was his age, and the second was his capacity. And there's one more coming. You see, even as a very old man, Moses was leading the children of Israel through a huge transition. These last 40 years in the wilderness had been quite a challenge to him. And the children of Israel were beginning to turn from this dynasty into a nation under God, from being nomads, always on the move, to being a settled nation in God's hands. And the last and greatest hurdle of this was about to come, the crossing of the Jordan River. And I can imagine some of the people saying, "Oh, Moses, I hope you're going to be with us with this final part of the journey. You know, we know you're not as fit as you were, but we love you to bits. You only have to say the word and we'll do it. If you say jump, we'll say how high." But Moses knew it was time to pass the baton on because of age and capacity, and one more we'll allude to a little later on. So why then did he have to pass it? Well, the obvious answer is none of us last forever. And when we look at the story of Moses, we can see that it was divided into basically 3 periods. If we look at his timeline of, say, the first 40 years of his life, we can call these 40 years of luxury. You may know the story. He was discovered by an Egyptian princess as a baby who took him under her wing. So Moses grew up in extravagant opulence. Every social advantage we can think of was his. He had the best education, the best connections, the greatest opportunities. He lived with the Pharaoh, one of the most powerful men on this earth at the time. And he developed skills in speaking, skills in writing, skills with leadership. And he rubbed shoulders with the glitterati of the day, as well as some of the most talented leaders on the globe at the time. But he never lost touch with his people. He never forgot his roots. And I can imagine as a teenager, he would feel increasing tension between his own life and his people's life. His luxury would stand in stark contrast to his own people, the Hebrews, who were living in slavery and in squalor. And I cannot help but think that's one of the powerful forces that motivated this man. And even through this period in God's economy, no experience was wasted. He was being trained, not only for what he was doing at the time, but also for what God was going to do in the future. And the same is true for us. As we look back on our lives, however long they may be, I don't think we've got anyone who's 120 here this morning, but you never know. However long they may be, no experience in God's economy ever needs to be wasted. Nothing that has happened to you is fluff. Nothing is useless to God, even the tough stuff, even the difficult stuff. Moses started with 40 years of luxury. And then the next 40 years of his life were 40 years of obscurity. You see, things changed in a flash for Moses one day when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster oppressing one of his people. And he challenged this taskmaster, and he ended up attacking him and murdering him. And he thought he'd been able to cover it up, but the attack came out into the open, and he fled the palace and became a nomadic shepherd in the hills of Midian. And there must have been times when Moses was living as a nomad up in the hills, when he looked back on his life in the palace. Maybe he could even see it in the distance. And he thought, what have I done to myself? He must have tortured himself with regret and remorse. And we know this was largely out of character for Moses, because later on he's described as the meekest man on the earth. In other words, a man less likely to commit murder you could hardly imagine. But torturing ourselves with regret is rarely helpful. And here we see this amazing grace of God, this amazing knack that God has of taking things, even some sinful things, and turning them around to make them useful for his purpose. We have no question that that murder was off limits as far as good ethics and following God was concerned. But God was able to take even an experience of failure and turn it into a force for good, because it moulded Moses. It turned him from a spoilt prince into a resilient shepherd. He had to look after himself. He had to dig deep in the personality and the emotions that he carried in order to live a life as a nomad in obscurity and be happy with it. And I look at this experience and I say, Lord, don't let bitter experiences turn me into a bitter person. Don't let bitter experiences turn me into a bitter person. Because Moses could have gone down that route. And it's one of the great what-ifs of history. Had Moses done that, we may never have seen the children of Israel reach the promised land. So 40 years of luxury, 40 years of obscurity. And then the final 40 years of Moses' life, I want to call 40 years of adversity. Now you might come to me and say, Ian, why not call it 40 years of leadership? Because surely Moses was the leader of the nation during this time. And yes, of course he was. But these 40 years were truly the toughest of his life. Moses led the people. He was placed there by God, but often they didn't want to be led. They didn't want to go God's way. They rebelled against Moses and implicitly rebelled against God too. They taunted Moses, they disappointed him, they let him down. And some of the most painful opposition that Moses experienced came from within. And this is the same with any spiritual leadership. Any Christian leader will tell you the same. Actually, any business leader may tell you the same, that some of the most hurtful opposition comes from within. If you look at the life stories of Billy Graham and examples of people like Bill Hybels and Rick Warren and Jeff Lucas and Malcolm Duncan and all the big names that we think about in the Christian world, they'll all tell you this. And so too with the little names, people that have hardly ever been heard about in the Christian world. Some of the most painful opposition comes from within. And all the time God was working in Moses to bring his people into their land, to fulfill God's side of the covenant. God was working in Moses too. The whole of life was God's school of character, right up to the very end. And that's just the same for us. The whole of your life is God's school of character. God's work in you won't be complete until you see him face to face. God's got work to do in you, and he has in me yet. And yet by now Moses is aware that the refining work of God was coming to an end. And so here's the third reason why Moses wants to pass on the baton. It's there in verse 2. Sorry, we will speed up in our exegesis in a moment. Verse 2. The third reason is not just age and capacity. The Lord had said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. Now, when he said that to all of Israel, we can imagine a sharp intake of breath and the sense of being abandoned to an uncertain future. While the physical reasons why Moses couldn't carry on are obvious, the primary reason is a spiritual one. The Lord has said to me, it's not right for me to go over. And so Moses is passing on the baton of leadership. He's passing on the DNA. He's passing on the values of the nation under God to his assistant. Well, let's unpack that and ask the question, what is it that Moses is passing on? What is it that we pass on when we hand the baton on to somebody else? Well, let's first look at Moses' example and recognize that Moses passes on his authority. He's no longer going to be God's leader on the ground. The people are going to need a new one. And of course he has someone in mind. He's going to pass on his faithfulness. Because through these 40 years, in fact for much longer than that, right back to his early days, Moses has been faithful to the nation. And the new leader needs to be faithful to the Lord and faithful to the direction the Lord has already taken the children of Israel in, not suddenly to decide to go on some alternative vision, to go back to Egypt or to go back into the desert. The new leader has to carry the DNA of the nation into the promised land. And it's weak people who think that when they're given a position of leadership, they have to change everything. Yes, often there are things that need to be changed. But if the DNA of the church or the nation or the town or the company or whatever isn't going to be maintained, then everyone is going to do their own thing. It was Moses' faithfulness to God and to the nation that needed to be passed on. Not only that, but Moses' courage needed to be passed on. Without question, Moses was a courageous leader, especially in the face of opposition from within. And his successor will need to do the same. Have you noticed that in Deuteronomy and in the book of Joshua, there are numerous references to Joshua being told to be strong and courageous? So maybe he was a bit timid. Maybe he wasn't so accustomed, maybe he had become so accustomed to being Moses' minister and his assistant that he got used to being the number two and rather kind of enjoyed the protection that gave him. But now the umbrella of Moses' leadership is going to get taken away from Joshua and he's going to be exposed. He's going to be on his own. Leadership can be very lonely. So Moses has to pass on his courage to his successor. He also needs to pass on his confidence in God. He wants to reassure his successor by saying he won't be alone and reassure the nation that they won't be alone. Look at verse 3. He says to the people, "The Lord your God himself will cross over you ahead of you. He will destroy the nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross the land ahead of you, as the Lord said." So the primary source of victory is God's victory. Joshua is the man who brings it about. Moses needs to pass on that confidence in God, that it is God who's going to go with them. He also needs to pass on his own compelling hope for the future. Leaders are purveyors of hope. They are the people who say, God can do this using us. And Moses does exactly that right here. But it's not, rather than being a sort of a blue sky idea without any kind of evidence, Moses reminds the people of two great examples of God's faithfulness already. You can see it in verse 4. The Lord will do to them what he did to Sihon and Og. We've encountered those two characters previously. The kings of the Amorites, whom the Lord destroyed along with their land. The Lord will deliver them to you, and you must do to them all that I have commanded you. So what? What do you do next? Be strong and courageous. Verse 6. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, because the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Here is Moses painting the picture of hope that God is going to be with them and presenting them with the evidence that he already has been. This is not pie in the sky stuff. Because a vision without a strategy is a pipe dream. What this is Moses saying, here's the vision. Here's the evidence. Now, my friends, let's trust God. Can you see the logic? So Moses has to pass on those 5 things to his successor. Well then, I've already dropped Joshua into the conversation already, but let's ask the question, who is it that Moses is going to pass the baton on to? Well, that's easy, we say, when we read the passage. It's going to be Joshua, surely. And we can hear him passing on his faithfulness and his courage. Look at verse 7. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him, in the presence of all of Israel. So he pulls Joshua up out in the audience, wherever he is, and he says to him, Joshua, be strong and courageous. Now, we've heard that several times already, haven't we? Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors to give to them. Now, the number of times that Moses says you is striking. Previously, he would have said me. And so he drives his message of courage home. Do not be afraid, he says. Do not be discouraged. And these are the two great temptations for leaders, fear and discouragement, especially when they're out on their own. And Moses is passionate about getting Joshua to protect himself from these two leadership traps. So what was it about Joshua that Moses particularly noticed? I'm going to suggest one or two reasons why. You'll have to write these down. One or two reasons why Joshua was the appropriate person. This isn't on the screen. First one is he was very skilled. He was highly skilled. Joshua wasn't qualified because he was young, and a great temptation is to say, we must always pass everything over to somebody who's younger. He wasn't qualified because he was young. He was qualified because he was able. He was skilled. He already brought well-refined expertise to the table. That's the first reason. Second reason why Joshua was qualified is because he was experienced. He'd already been Moses' sidekick for many years. The Bible actually describes Joshua as Moses' minister, his helper, his number two, the one who ministers to him, his right-hand man. And as somebody gets to the age of 120, particularly without a lot of the medical expertise that we have today, it's quite likely that Moses would have had cataracts or his eyes were failing. It's quite likely he would be very arthritic and not able to move very quickly. It's quite likely that he'd be suffering from all of these things that we can get relief from these days, but from which they had no relief in their day. So he needed a number two. He needed a number two to point out which way to walk or to read a document. And that was Joshua. He was Moses' minister, his helper, his right-hand man. So Joshua's experience was unique. Sitting alongside this great leader, when Moses had heard from the Lord, Joshua wasn't far away. And so Joshua learned what it was like to listen to God. When Moses had to handle difficult cases, Joshua would have seen him do it. And perhaps had a talk afterwards. Moses, what was going through your mind at that time? When Moses had to make a tough leadership call, Joshua was there on the sidelines watching. So Moses gave his minister, his assistant, thousands of directional cues as to how to lead the nation and lead it well. Joshua was experienced. Moses had tutored him to be one of those rare leaders whose attention God can get when he wants it, that he's not running so fast or involved so deeply with his own agenda that when God taps him on the shoulder, he says, yes, Lord, what do you want? He was an experienced man. So he was skilled and experienced. Another reason why Joshua was the right man was because he was called. He had God's call on his life. And that call was recognized by Moses and the people and all the people around him. There's a great parallel of this in the New Testament. When Paul was in the early church, he was looking for an assistant too. And he came upon this man called Timothy. And right at the very beginning of Paul and Timothy's relationship, something significant happened. Now later on, of course, we discover that Timothy had been schooled by his mother and grandmother who were faithful Christians. But when Paul met him, he noticed something about the people around Timothy. You can read this in the book of Acts. Paul said, I took him on board because everyone spoke well of him. Now, isn't that interesting? Yes, he was skilled. Yes, he was available. Yes, he had a bit of experience. He'd been schooled. But everyone spoke well of him. There wasn't a single person in the church who said, oh, well, you know, he's all right on a good day, but he's a bit of a jerk behind the scenes. Or he'll talk a good talk. He'll make up a good story. When you dig into the detail, there's not a lot there. Everyone spoke well of him. And Paul said, that's the man I want. So Joshua was the main person, the primary person Moses was going to pass his baton on to. But it wasn't just Joshua. We notice that passage tells us it was also the Levite priests. They were to carry the spiritual DNA of the nation. Verse 9, so Moses wrote down his law and gave it to the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. So the religious leaders, the Levites, and the political leaders, the elders, all had to carry the DNA of the nation. And if they had to carry it, then so too did the people. You'll see this in verse 10. Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, the year of cancelling debts, there's to be a festival of tabernacles. At that moment, you're to read out God's covenant, read his promise, remind yourself of it. Don't let it get stuck away in some cupboard or saved on some hard drive. No, make it public. And isn't it wonderful that the moment that Moses chose to make the covenant of God public was their biggest and most lavish celebration, where everyone brought free will offerings, the Feast of Tabernacles. So everyone, men, women, children, he talks about the aliens in your midst, I think, people who are foreigners, everybody heard how good God was in the context of celebrating that goodness. So who's the DNA to be passed on to? Joshua is the key leader. The Levite priests and the elders were the religious and the civic leaders, and all the people needed to know about it as well. Well, this surely is going to lead to huge blessing in the nation. So what may happen as a result of it? Look at verse 14. And the Lord said to Moses, now the day of your death is near. Call Joshua and present yourselves at the tent of meeting, where I will commission him. So Moses and Joshua came and presented themselves at the tent of meeting. This was a private meeting. Moses, Joshua, and the presence of God. Verse 15, and the Lord appeared at the tent in a pillar of cloud. And the cloud stood over the entrance to the tent. And I don't know about you, but at this point I would expect God to thank Moses for all he'd done, to affirm him for his leadership, to congratulate him for his achievements. Well, there's none of that. The Lord said to Moses, you are going to rest with your ancestors. But these people will soon prostitute themselves to foreign gods of the land they are entering. They will forsake me and break the covenant I have made with them. It would have broken Moses' heart to see that happen. So serious was the people's diversion from having God as their number one priority in their lives and their land and their nation. So serious was it about to become that God describes it as prostitution. Having sex with someone who is not your wife or your husband and paying good money for it. And that's what the children of Israel did. They paid high prices for following the warped gods of the Canaanites, and they abandoned the Lord. In fact, the rest of the Old Testament is all about God seeking to win his people back. My friends, never take God's blessing for granted. Moses urged the people, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your strength and all of your mind. and I'm doing just the same.